Hey everyone, this is Dan Neppin. Welcome to the Note Investor Podcast. In this episode, I'm going to be talking about making phone calls when you're doing due diligence. And now, this episode is just going to be me talking again, but then over the next few weeks, we're going to get back to doing a series of interviews. All right, so making phone calls is obviously one of the most key parts of the due diligence process, and it's something that in different training programs and things you know, they don't always provide a lot of detail on this. A lot of times they just say call utilities, call code enforcement. But in this episode, I want to get into a little bit of the nitty gritty of exactly what it is you're trying to uncover when you make these phone calls and what to say in different situations. Because a lot of people who are new to this get a little bit confused on some of these things, and they may not be 100% obvious when you're just starting out. So, I want to kind of start off by talking about why this is so important. So, even though we live in this world where you can find all kinds of data online, a lot of your due diligence data may be given to you by your seller. There's some data that you're only going to be able to get by getting on the phone and actually talking to someone. And I want to point out too that when we're making these phone calls, at least for my process, I don't make these phone calls until after I've made a bid and it's been accepted. You could make some of these phone calls prior to placing a bid, but because most bids don't go anywhere, most bids don't get accepted, I don't think they'd be a really efficient use of my time. So this is stuff I'm doing only once I've had a bid that's already been accepted. So we want to make a handful of different calls. So we want to talk to a local realtor, and I like to do this so that I can understand the local neighborhood. And a lot of times too, I'll ask them to give me some photos of the property and a quick estimate of the value. You want to talk to code enforcement, see if there are any outstanding liens or any violations, any outstanding issues going on with the property. Because especially if you're buying a contract for deed where you're going to be on title, if there are code issues, they're going to be calling you. And then checking the utilities. So, in my model, I'm buying owner occupied so that I can get these things reperforming again. And I'll call two different utilities, usually call water and then electric or gas. And so I want to know if the utilities are on, because if they're off, it's probably not an occupied house, in which case I'm not going to want the asset. And then if there is one, also give a call to the HO, to the homeowners association. You want to find out if there are any balances due and any kind of special rules that property owners in that area have to follow. Now, most of the assets on the secondary market are typically not in neighborhoods that have a homeowners association, but if you're buying condos, especially, or a lot of stuff in Florida, HOAs do show up from time to time. Let's talk about calling your local realtors, and the key thing here is you want to get a realtor who understands REOs and foreclosures and short sales, and is someone who actually specializes in working on those things and likes to work on them. Most realtors out there don't. The vast majority of retailers are just dealing with retail buyers and sellers, and don't always work with investors. And there's this small subcategory that actually specializes in doing REOs and foreclosures. And so if you have the wrong realtor, they're not going to really be able to help you that much. And so when we find the right realtor, there's a couple different things we're trying to find out when we make this call. So for one, we'd like to get a good point of contact in case the note does turn into an REO, in case we have to go through foreclosure or end up doing a cash for keys. A realtor who specializes in REOs generally also has a ton of contact with vendors who will be able to help you get locks changed, do clean outs, do other work on the property. Getting the right realtor contact that knows REOs just will make your life so much easier if you have an REO. They can also give you information about the neighborhood that you can't get online. I'll do things like look at truly a crime data and sometimes niche.com and other things to understand neighborhoods, but it's usually pretty generic. If you get the right person, they can really give you the lowdown on what's going on in a particular area or how that neighborhood relates to other neighborhoods that are nearby. And then I'm also going to ask them if they can get me some photos of the property and a quick assessment of the value. Generally, I don't ask for a full-blown BPO when I call. I'm usually pulling a regular BPO from one of my vendors, like Dickey Baldwin or sometimes Zone. But I like to get two data points if possible. And so the second data point from the realtor, I'm just asking them for a quick assessment because I don't want to have to pay them for a BPO. I can usually get that for free, right? And so while it's kind of redundant with the BPO in some ways, I like having two data points if I can because it's interesting. More and more, I don't always get two. It's not really a requirement, but I think it's a good thing to do because it seems like the more often I get two value estimates from different realtors, they are often really far apart. When I was kind of starting out, I had this tendency like to take BPO values as like holy gospel, and I've realized more and more just how much uncertainty there is with that data, and that's not even accounting for the fact that these are exterior BPOs, right? We're not even getting to see the inside. So if you can get multiple data points on your value, that can help you a lot for making a mistake. And if you do find a good realtor who specializes in REOs in this area, put their contact info in your CRM because sometimes I make contact with these folks and for whatever reason I can't close on the deal because there are other problems that pop up in due diligence. But I always want to keep track of realtors that I can work with in different cities because I want to get notes in the future. I'll do a search through my CRM and pull them back up. Now, where do you actually find the right local realtor? Well, the first thing I'll do is I'll go look in my CRM to see if I've already found one in that city. Now, if you're brand new to doing notes, you're not going to have that, but there are a lot of other things we can do. I'll ask for recommendations on some of the note investing Facebook groups and meetup groups that are out there. Chris Evany and Gail Greenberg's Good Deeds Facebook group is really good. They have a podcast as well, or like Dave Putz's what is it called? East Coast Distressed Note Investing, something like that. There are a number of different groups out there, people who will help you. And then also your direct network, right? If you have other friends who are in the note investing and they're active in a particular city, they may have a point of contact they can send you to. If all those fails, I'll often get online and look at what listings are nearby. So if there's a realtor who has a house listed, on the same street, well, number one, they're at least going to know that area really well. So even if they don't do foreclosures, you can talk to them about the neighborhood, if nothing else. But it can be a good way to find folks who are active in that area. And then the other thing that I'll do a lot is I'll just go on Google Maps and I'll do a search for realtors near the property address. So I'll just say, do a Google Map search for realtors near and then put the address in. Because if I find a realtor that's like around the corner or very close by, then when I call them up and ask them to drive by and take some photos, it's a much smaller ask. If I call somebody who's all the way on the other side of town, then it's going to be a 45-minute drive. That's a pretty big ask. That's going to be harder to get them to do that. But if I find somebody that happens to be super close, they probably already know the neighborhood and it's pretty simple for them to go and do that. They're going to generally be more willing to help you out. All right. Now, what do you actually say when you get a hold of a realtor on the phone? And remember, our first thing is, right, we want to make sure that they're the kind of realtor who works with investors. So I'll say things like, hello, I'm calling because I'm looking for a realtor in this area who works with REOs and foreclosures. And usually they'll tell you right away. If that's not them, they'll let you know, or if it is, they will. And then I'll ask them, is this something you do, or if not, is there anyone you can recommend? A lot of times I'll talk to a realtor and they'll say, well, that's not what I do, but there's this other guy, Bob, in our office. He handles that stuff. Let me put you in touch with him. Or a lot of times they'll have a friend in town who's a realtor who specializes in REO. So usually the first person you're going to find, you call is probably not going to be the right one. But if you tell them what you're looking for and ask them for a recommendation, they're usually going to know somebody in that area who does what you're looking for and can point you there. And then, I'll ask them, what can you tell me about this area? I might say things like, hey, I've invested in Dayton, but I haven't actually invested in Columbus. What can you tell me about, what's going on in Columbus in this particular area? And then I will tell them that, I'm investing in non-performing mortgage notes and I'm looking at one in your area. Can you drive by and take some photos and give me a quick estimate of the value? This is one that's likely to turn into an REO some months in the future. And so I'm very upfront about what I'm doing. Sometimes when you tell them you're looking at a property, they'll assume it's listed and they'll start pulling it up. They're like, well, I don't see it listed on the MLS. And you just have to explain to them, hey, I'm just, I'm buying the note. This thing's non-performing. Um, there's a good chance it goes to foreclosure. So I'm trying to figure out things ahead of time. And then when I'm making that ask to do a drive-by and get some photos and a quick estimate of the value, this is supplementing my other BPO. So the way I do it is I try to make the ask kind of as small as possible. I'll tell them like, look, I'm not looking for a full-blown BPO. This could turn into a foreclosure in a few months, maybe not. And then the other thing I'll ask them too, and this is a good way to screen if you got the right person, I'll ask them, do you have any vendors you work with who can secure and clean out REOs? Because someone who specializes in REOs is pretty much always going to have that. If they don't have that at all, then it's probably not something they specialize in. And then it's also good to ask them if the neighborhood has an HOA, if you think it does. I mean, some of these older neighborhoods in certain cities, there's not an HOA. But if there's any uncertainty, it's obviously always good to ask the realtor because they're generally going to know that. So some other things, just, understand that most of the realtors you talk to, they're doing traditional sales and they're not going to be working with note investors. And, if you don't find the right one right away, just keep calling. If you find one that's like kind of willing to take pictures but not that interested, it's probably not going to work out. Don't try to, force things just because it was the first person that you talked to. If it's not the right person, keep calling, get the right one. And then if the realtor asks, well, how much are you willing to pay for this? That's like a giant red flag. Whenever I've had a realtor ask that, things never work out. What you're trying to do is find the person where this is in their wheelhouse and they're more than willing to go by and drive by and give you a quick estimate. If they want a bunch of money for a full-blown BPO or their main concern is how much you're going to pay them to do this, then you kind of got the wrong person. Best bet is just to move on. Now I will pay realtors to do this, and I usually always offer to pay them to do that, but I don't. But if they're leading with that, if that's their main concern, then they're just probably not going to be the right person. Okay. And a lot of times I'll ask you if you have a specific BPO template that you want. So a lot of banks and larger institutions have these. If you do have one, that's awesome. But if you don't, that's fine. I don't have one myself. Um, I'll just say, look, I'm just looking for a quick value and some photos. If they do want a template, then I'll give them an example of, one of the other BPOs I've got from another deal and say, well, you can use this. This works real well. But obviously, us individual note investors are not like banks where we have all these crazy specific requirements. All right, now moving on to code enforcement. This is really a critical one. So finding the code enforcement office is pretty easy. I'll just go on Google and search, code enforcement and then the name of that city, and usually the phone number pops up right away. You'll be calling to ask them, you're looking for liens for one and code violations. So when you ask them about liens, it's kind of a double check against your O&E report. The O&E report should show any liens, but I like to just call and ask them anyways. But then I also want to ask them about violations or anything else that might be going on because there could be other problems, there could be other fines lurking that have not actually turned into an official lien yet that would show up on the O&E report. And sometimes they can give you some insanely detailed information about the neighborhood or the street or the property, especially if you happen to be calling about a property that's like one of their problem children properties. Seems like all of these, um, you know, all these cities have it's like their list of usual suspects. It's like they have their handful of just repeat offenders and they know those properties really well. So if the asset that you're looking at is one of those, you really want to know that up front because they're going to be calling you, especially if it's a contract for deed later on. If it is a problem property, they're probably going to let you know right away, but it doesn't hurt to ask specifically. I actually just had one this week where I was talking to, it's a note that I closed on, and I was talking to the code enforcement folks because the borrowers had some trash that was blowing onto the neighbor's property. And she was telling me that this has been going on for a long time and they've had a variety of violations over the last few years. And that was actually news to me. When I had called originally doing my due diligence, there were no liens out there, there were no fines pending, and everything looked all good. But what I start doing now is ask them specifically, is this one of your problem properties, so that you know that if going in. So specific things you might say is, hey, I just tell them I'm calling to see if there are any outstanding liens or code violations on this property. And then, I can ask them things like, well, if there is a lien, was the violation that led to this lien on a different property or against this one? And the reason I ask that is, particularly if you're buying contract for deeds from folks like Home Opportunity and Window Rock, some of these companies just have a policy of not paying liens. And what happens is, if a, well, what cities will often, so let me back up. I screwed that up. So some of these companies who own a lot of contract for deeds just won't pay code liens. They'll let them rack up. So what a lot of cities will do is, if they have one of these properties with a lot of code liens, they'll actually tie that lien to all the properties that that business owns or that entity owns in their jurisdiction. So there might have been a property that racked up a bunch of code liens, and then the city will tie that lien to like 5 or 6 different properties. So if you're looking at buying a note and there's a code lien against it, you kind of want to know if it was originally against that property or not. Because if it was against that property, then that kind of tells you something potentially about the condition. If it was against a different property, well, then, that's kind of good because at least it wasn't a problem with this one. Although that lien is still attached, you're going to have to deal with that. I'll ask them if they know the property's occupied. If it's one of their usual suspects that they know well, they'll really know. There was one I called about quite a while ago in Kansas City. The seller had listed it as owner occupied. And when I talked to code enforcement, they said, oh, yeah, this has been vacant for a couple of years. And then they gave me all the nitty gritty detail of the guy who used to live there and when he moved out, and then a whole ton of crazy things that happened afterwards, including break-ins and squatters and people camping in the backyard and all sorts of crazy things. If they ask if you're the owner, just tell them who you are. Just say, hey, I'm in the process of buying the property, and I want to understand if there are any liens that I'm going to have to pay. Don't try to explain note investing to them. You don't have to do that. And I do kind of dangle that too, where I say, hey, I wanted to know if there are any fines, any liens that I'm gonna have to pay when I buy this. Because a lot of times, if you dangle the idea that you might be sending the money, then a lot of times they get more cooperative and sometimes more helpful. All right, now utilities. So your goal in calling the utilities is you want to verify that the property is occupied. I like to call 2 different utilities. Usually always calling water and then electric or gas. I find in a lot of cases for vacant property, sometimes like one has been turned off, but the other is still on. So if you just call one and it's on, that doesn't necessarily tell you what you need to know. So it pays to call more than one. Although I have run into cases where just because the utilities are off, that doesn't even necessarily mean it's vacant. I mean, obviously, most of the time it does, but I had one last winter. It was in Michigan. The water had been shut off for a month, and I had photos of the property. It had been snowing, and there was a car there, and there were tire tracks in the snow and footprints, and there was like obviously somebody living there, but the water had been off for like over 30 days, and I couldn't figure out like what is this person doing? I don't know how you live in a house without water. That's got to be, it's got to, I don't know, that must get stinky. So just because they're off it, there could be somebody there. And actually, that particular borrower then paid the back water bill, got the utilities turned back on. I ended up buying that note, and they've been paying since then. So mileage varies on these deals. You always run into crazy situations, but by and large, if the utilities are off, that thing's going to be vacant. Now, if they ask who you are, I just tell them I'm the bank. I'm with the bank. I'm calling to verify the status of the utilities. And if they ask your bank or company name, I just give it to them. So I'm Dan Deppen, Fusion Notes, LLC. And then if it's possible, I try to get a status of the account. So when you call utilities in particular, most of the time they will just, if you're not the borrower whose name is on the account, they'll usually just tell you the status, whether it's on or off, but you can sometimes get more information. So I'll ask them if the account is current, or if they tell me it's not current, I'll ask them how much is owed, because that can kind of be helpful in giving you an idea of the borrower's overall picture. Now, a lot of times they just won't do that, but sometimes they do, so I try to get as much as I can. If it's not current, I'll ask them when the utilities are going to be shut off. I've called ones before where the utilities were on, but they were about to be shut off in a couple days. So that's obviously kind of a red flag. So I'll try to get that information as well. The other thing I'll do too is if they'll just give me the on or off, sometimes I'll call back later and you can get another person, especially if it's a larger utility. Because I've done that before where I've called back later, get someone else, and then they spill their guts on everything that's going on. So if you get stuck on the first call, don't be afraid to call back. Now, homeowners associations, these don't come up a ton for me. Like I said in the beginning, in Florida, they're obviously pretty common. If it's condos, they're pretty common. A lot of the, contract for deeds, other mortgages in the Midwest, in older neighborhoods, typically don't have them, but they do come up. So in most cases, there won't be one. I like to ask the realtor about the HOA when I talk to them. And then when you do call the HOA, I'll ask them if there are any outstanding balances or liens, similar to when you're calling code. And then I'll also ask them what the regular HOA dues are, because if there is an HOA, you're going to want to really have a good understanding of what all those expenses are to put those in your ROI calculator, because if it's a non-performing note that you don't get reperforming, if they're not paying the mortgage, they're probably not paying the HOA dues either, which means that you'll be paying them. So if you're in especially if this is one of those in Florida where it has some longer foreclosure times, you want to make sure that in your pricing, you're going to want to make sure that you account for paying those HOA dues as you go along. And then also ask them if there are any other special rules or requirements. So I've talked about this one previously, but I ran into one a while ago on a condo in Florida where it required buying a membership to a country club that had a $70,000 non-refundable initiation fee and then super high dues on top of that, which just crushed the value of all the condos in the area. So that one's kind of unusual, but make sure you ask because you never know what you're going to find. And then I'll say that, rules on how enforceable these HOA liens are vary a lot state by state. So if you do find an HOA lien, I would talk to your attorney in that state. If it's one in Florida, I would suggest talking to Erin Quinn. She's really good. She's helped me out with some. But I'm not an attorney, and there's so much variability and so much nuance in these. I don't really want to get into that yet here. So 'cause when I run into these, I just call my attorney and give them the details and let them tell me what the situation is. All right, so that wraps up this one. You got any questions on this, feel free to drop me an email, Dan at Fusion Notes. And like I said, the next, I've gone a couple weeks here where it's just been me jabbering about various topics, but the next several weeks now we'll have a run of interviews, which I think are going to be really good. I think I got some interesting folks coming on. All right, so till next time.